Hi, I'm Kelly Monaco. I'm currently unemployed, so I created this channel to earn some extra income. I'll be updating you with the latest news about the Drama General Hospital.
Hello and welcome back. Danny had reached the most dangerous point a grieving boy could ever reach. The point where pain stopped feeling like sorrow and began to feel like purpose. What made him so frightening now was not rage alone, but the cold, stubborn clarity forming inside him, the belief that everyone around him was too slow, too cautious, too willing to dress cowardice up as wisdom while Jason paid the price. In Danny's mind, the adults of Port Charles had already failed. They had failed to protect his father, failed to stop the men who thrived in the shadows, failed to keep violence from swallowing one life after another. Sidwell had become the shape of everything rotten in that world, a man whose power fed on fear, secrets, and the quiet compromises of people who told themselves they were only trying to survive. For Danny, revenge no longer felt reckless. It felt clean. It felt honest. It felt like the only thing left that had not been poisoned by excuses. That was what made his obsession so much worse than teenage anger. This was not a passing outburst. It was calculation growing in silence. It was a boy replaying fragments of conversations, memorizing names, reconstructing motives, connecting accidents to enemies, and enemies to hidden truths. Somewhere in the middle of that spiral, Danny stopped thinking of himself as a son who needed protection and started imagining himself as the one who would finish what others were too weak to do. Every warning only hardened him. Every attempt to calm him sounded like betrayal. Every plea for patience felt like a demand that he accept Jason's suffering as normal. Danny could not accept that. Not anymore. He had begun living inside a private storm where justice and vengeance wore the same face, where every pulse of grief pushed him closer to the edge without him even realizing how far he had already gone. Charlotte saw it before most people did. Maybe that was because she understood better than anyone how darkness could hide beneath intelligence, how a wounded heart could turn secretive and sharp and strangely fearless. Danny did not need to explain every detail for her to understand the danger. She could hear it in the flatness of his voice when he mentioned Sidwell, in the way he no longer talked like someone imagining possibilities, but like someone preparing for an outcome. There was something chilling in that shift. Danny was no longer fantasizing about revenge. He was building toward it. Charlotte knew enough about powerful men, manipulative networks, and the wreckage left behind by family legacies to recognize where this path ended. It never ended with relief. It never ended with peace. It ended with blood, silence, and one more life ruined before adulthood had even begun. That was why Charlotte reached for Alexis, not because she was weak, but because she knew this was bigger than teenage rebellion. Alexis represented the last line between damage and disaster, one of the few people smart enough to understand how quickly a desperate child could become evidence in someone else's war. Charlotte did not come to her with dramatic panic. What frightened Alexis more was how measured Charlotte was, how carefully she laid out her concerns, how she spoke not like a girl gossiping about reckless behavior, but like a witness describing the early signs of collapse. Danny was asking the wrong questions. He was disappearing into his own head. He was becoming obsessed with what he thought he had seen, what he thought he had figured out, and what he believed no adult had the courage to expose. Alexis listened, and beneath her lawyer's calm, something cold moved through her. She knew that tone. She knew what happened when intelligence fused with grief and self-righteousness. It created people who could talk themselves into anything. But the truth was even more dangerous than Charlotte realized, because Danny's obsession was not born from fantasy alone. At the scene of Jordan's crash, in the confusion and adrenaline that followed terror, Danny had noticed something he was never supposed to notice. While others focused on survival, shock, and the desperate need to make sense of what had happened, Danny's eyes had locked onto a detail that felt wrong. It was small enough to be dismissed by anyone not already primed to suspect a larger design, but Danny was primed. He was watching the world like a trap. He saw the hidden fracture in the official version of events, the evidence that this was not random chaos, but part of a deeper pattern tied to Sidwell's reach. Whether it was a dropped device, a scrambled message, a planted signal, or some overlooked mark that did not belong at an ordinary accident scene, Danny understood one thing instantly. Jordan's crash was connected to something far more deliberate than anyone wanted to admit. From that moment on, everything changed. Danny no longer believed he was chasing revenge in the abstract. He believed he had proof. That belief transformed his grief into mission. It made him bolder, less predictable, more willing to take risks he could not measure. He began revisiting the memory of that night over and over, stripping it down to seconds, angles, sounds, movements. The burning metal, the fear, the confusion, the desperate human noise of a moment when lives could have ended, and behind all of it, that hidden clue pulsing in his mind like a second heartbeat. He became convinced that Jordan's accident was not just another tragedy in Port Charles, but a doorway into the truth about Sidwell, a truth uglier and more explosive than anyone had dared say out loud. If he could prove that, then Jason's suffering would no longer be just one piece of a larger injustice. It would become part of an undeniable chain of crimes. That was the trap. The closer Danny came to the truth, the more he started to believe he alone deserved to carry it. He stopped trusting adults because adults complicated everything. They weighed consequences. They protected reputations. They worried about process. Danny did not care about process. He cared about exposure. He cared about tearing away the polished layers that let men like Sidwell keep moving through Port Charles like untouchable kings. In his mind, delay was complicity, silence was surrender. The law was too slow, too porous, too easily manipulated by the powerful, so he began making choices in secret, following his own trail, testing his own theories, and drifting further from the people who might have saved him from himself. Charlotte felt him slipping and hated how powerless that made her feel. She had wanted to help, but helping Danny now meant standing near a fire that was beginning to burn without control. There were moments when she caught flashes of the boy he had been, the hurt beneath the hardness, the raw ache of a son trying to carry more than he could bear. Those moments made everything more painful, because they reminded her that he was not evil or broken. He was drowning. He was turning into someone sharp and dangerous because pain had convinced him danger was the only language the world respected. Charlotte wanted to pull him back, but every attempt to reach him only seemed to confirm his suspicion that she, too, was becoming part of the wall between him and the truth. The more she tried to slow him down, the more he looked at her as if she were choosing safety over loyalty. Alexis understood that what threatened Danny was not only Sidwell, but the intoxicating moral logic of revenge itself. That logic always began with love. Love for a parent, love for justice, love for the version of the world that should have existed. But once grief corrupted that love, it became something else. It became permission. Alexis saw in Danny the beginnings of the same fatal pattern that had destroyed so many lives in Port Charles. The conviction that because the wound was real, any response to it must also be justified. She knew she had to intervene carefully. Push too hard, and Danny would vanish deeper into secrecy. Move too slowly, and he would act before anyone could stop him. She had handled criminals, liars, manipulators, and desperate clients, but this was different. This was a child standing at the threshold of becoming something harder than himself. And while Alexis tried to build a net beneath him, Danny kept moving toward the revelation that would change everything. What he had found at the crash site was not merely evidence of recklessness or a tragic miscalculation. It pointed toward intention, toward planning, toward the horrifying possibility that Jordan's brush with death was part of a broader design linked to Sidwell's panic, grief, and lust for retaliation. Sidwell was no longer just a man mourning a loss and lashing out wildly. In Danny's mind, he was something colder, a strategist turning chaos into camouflage, a predator using the grief surrounding him as cover for new crimes. Once Danny let himself believe that, there was no going back. He began to see every silence as a cover-up, every contradiction as proof, every adult hesitation as fear of the explosion that would follow if Sidwell's real crimes were dragged into the light. That explosion was coming. The truth about Jordan's accident and the secret Danny found there could not remain buried forever, not with so many lives already circling the same fire. When it surfaced, it would not simply expose Sidwell as dangerous. It would expose how many people had underestimated the depth of the rot, how close Danny had come to being consumed by the very darkness he thought he was fighting, and how fragile the line truly was between a boy seeking justice for Jason and a young soul willing to destroy himself to get it. The tragedy of Danny's journey was not that he wanted the truth. It was that he wanted it so badly he began to believe his own destruction was an acceptable price. In the end, that may be the cruelest turn of all. Sidwell's guilt may indeed be uncovered. The secret from Jordan's crash may shatter the lies protecting him. The crimes may finally be named, the pattern exposed, the mask ripped away in full view of Port Charles. But by then, the cost may already be written across Danny's face, Charlotte's fear, and Alexis's helpless realization that truth does not always arrive in time to save the people chasing it. Sometimes it arrives after obsession has already done its work. Sometimes the villain is exposed only after the innocent have been pushed to the brink. And in Danny's case, the most devastating question is no longer whether Sidwell's crimes will be revealed. It is whether Danny will still recognize himself when they are.
I'll be back at the General Hospital soon. We'll see each other again soon. Thank you for supporting my channel. Goodbye and see you again.